The scramble for Africa is, I believe, one of the most poorly understood periods in history. From what I gather, most people seem to believe that the colonial powers one day sat around a map at the Berlin Conference, drawing borders around bits they wanted, and that was it. But the scramble had already begun by the time of the conference of 1884, plus the conference stated that any claimant must show effective occupation of a region before it was granted to them. This meant in some instances there were literal races between explorers, far more intense than just drawing lines on a map. During the scramble, great powers like Britain and France nearly went to war. It brought about a revolution in Portugal, and, I'd argue, with the exception of maybe the Zulus and Ethiopians, the Africans and their battles against colonialism are often just completely ignored. Plus, the fact that some African countries like Egypt and Ethiopia actually expanded is also often glossed over. But to understand the scramble, you really need to go back in time. Well, maybe you don't, but there's some fascinating empires, wars, and cultural exchanges beforehand. The first European colonies in Africa were set up by the Portuguese, as bases along their route to India. These included Madeira in the Atlantic, Sofala in Mozambique, Luanda in Angola, and Mombasa and Zanzibar in East Africa. These all proved to be important stopover points for international trade, and this was pretty much the standard for colonialism at that time. It was far more profitable to set up factories for trade and control sea lanes, rather than taking over entire regions. As such, the Portuguese would also set up colonies in the Spice Islands, Hormuz in Persia, and, important to this story, in Oman. The Spanish and Portuguese had agreed to divide the world in two, so they had little competition from Europeans in Africa. But late in the 16th century, the Iberian Union united Portugal with Spain, and as such, the Portuguese entered into Spain's wars against the Dutch and the English. The Dutch were quick to move into the colonial game and took Mina from the Portuguese. They expanded in West Africa, established the Dutch slave coast, and built forts in Senegal. Plus, for a few decades, they even held Portuguese Luanda. While in the south, in the middle of the 17th century, they entered Cape Town, an important midway point for ships sailing between the oceans. The Dutch that settled in this region became the Boers. However, the locals in South Africa that they encountered during this period were not the Zulu, they were the Khoikhoi. These are often grouped together with the San hunter-gatherers, but they were a distinct group of people. The Zulu, on the other hand, didn't enter the picture for another few decades, as they were Bantu who migrated from the north. However, to further complicate matters, there were also the Xhosa in South Africa at that time, and they are closely related to the Bantu. There is some debate over when the Xhosa arrived, but their language shows that they may have been there a lot sooner, as they adopted some of the click sounds from the local San people. Hence Xhosa is usually pronounced something like Xhosa. But I think it's time to explain a bit about the African people and their kingdoms. So this is going to be a gross oversimplification, I'm aware of that, as I'm trying to explain about 200 years of African history, but here goes. Let's start with the Bantu. They originated probably from Cameroon, and they migrated south and east. This migration lasted potentially thousands of years, so don't think of it like a mass movement of people. They became the dominant group in many countries in Central and South Africa over time, but they often lived alongside the original inhabitants. So in South Africa, and especially in Namibia, you still have the San people. Plus, alongside the Bantu in Congo, you have the Pygmies. Plus, it was the Bantu who established the Kingdom of Congo in Central Africa. And this kingdom in the early 1600s sent an ambassador to meet with the Pope in Rome. He was Emanuele Nevunda, but after travelling via Brazil and Spain, he died 2 days after arriving in Rome. This kingdom also built cities larger than some in Europe, and many of their rulers became Christian very early on and adopted European fashions. Congolese men also joined Christian religious orders, they had their own coats of arms, and the kingdom survived in one form or another until the 19th century. So you had an almost European Christian kingdom in Central Africa, which had connections with the papacy and a large urban population. But their country was often torn apart by civil war, and strangely during one of these wars in the late 1600s, a prophet emerged. This prophet was Kimpa Vita, and she had visions claiming that Jesus was in fact born in the Congo. So it was sort of like an African version of Mormonism. Otherwise, in Central Africa you had many kingdoms, like the kingdoms of Burundi and Rwanda, which were established there in the late 1600s. From very early on, these kingdoms were based on Tutsi dominance over the Hutus, and this power dynamic would still be very important in the 20th century, leading to genocides in the respective countries and the outbreak of the First Congo War. In southern Africa, it was also the Bantu, specifically the Shona people, who built Great Zimbabwe in medieval times. But by the 1600s, Great Zimbabwe had fallen, and power in the region was transferred to Mutapa in Mozambique. This kingdom of Mutapa, however, was eventually weakened due to infighting and Portuguese interference. So by the late 17th century, they often accepted the vassalage of the Portuguese, or even their other new neighbour, the Rosvi Empire. The Rosvi grew rich on gold and were a formidable power, so they were able to fight back numerous Portuguese attempts to take over their gold mines. Going further north along the coast, and the Muslims once ruled over the important trading centres of Zanzibar and Mombasa. But their Kilwa Sultanate was already on the decline when the Portuguese arrived, and it ultimately collapsed. This allowed the Portuguese to take over these trading centres, but soon a new power emerged in the region. And anyone who has played Victoria 2 will know this power, Oman. Their capital of Muscat had been held by the Portuguese, but they were driven out of there in the 1600s, and the new Yoruba dynasty capitalised on their victory and chased the Portuguese west and took over the east coast of Africa. Zanzibar in particular would become an important trading centre for the lucrative Arab slave trade, something that played a very important role during the scramble for Africa centuries later. Plus, it was from Zanzibar that many Arab slavers would form trading centres deep into the interior of Africa. Further north still, you had more Muslim sultanates in Somalia, like Ajuran, who fought back a couple Portuguese invasions. While nearby, the Adal Sultanate in the 1500s tried to conquer their Christian neighbours the Ethiopians, but the Portuguese came to the aid of the Ethiopians and prevented the takeover from happening. The Ottomans, on the other hand, would come to the aid of the Muslims, starting the Ottoman-Portuguese War, which spread from East Africa all the way over to India. Now, in previous centuries, the Somalians were pretty intrepid explorers, as people like Said of Mogadishu made his way over to China in the 1300s. By now, though, they began to fall behind Europeans in terms of maritime technology and trade, but the port of Berbera continued to be incredibly important well into the 19th century. It was said during this time that thousands of camels would arrive at the port, bringing ivory, cattle, hides and the likes, ready to be shipped across Arabia and beyond. But their failures against Ethiopia meant that Ethiopia would remain an independent Christian kingdom trapped behind Muslim lands. So many Christians believed that this was the homeland of Prester John, a fictional Christian king of great wealth who would aid the Europeans in their conquest of the Islamic empires. Plus, this idea of Prester John encouraged many Europeans to explore the region. Furthermore, as a Christian kingdom, Ethiopia, like the Congo, had connections with Europe and the papacy. For instance, they sent ambassadors to the Council of Florence in the 1430s, and they even tried to form an alliance with the King of Aragon against the Muslims before that. Going even further back, their ruler, Lalibela, built huge stone churches which bear his name in the 12th century, as a sort of second Jerusalem. This came shortly after the Muslims reconquered the city of Jerusalem, so they were present in the Middle East during the Crusades, and Ethiopians, along with their Christian neighbours to the north, were sometimes present in the courts of the Byzantine Empire. Yet this whole area of East Africa, as you would expect, had a completely different racial makeup. Its position on the Indian Ocean brought in a number of Arab merchants who brought Islam to the area. Then, within Ethiopia, they had a number of different ethnicities, like the Tigrayans and the Amharans. Amharic was the language of the empire for the most part, but this was a Semitic language, closer to those in the Middle East rather than anything in Africa. Plus, in future centuries, many of the Ethiopian rulers and elites, just like many of the Europeans, would consider the Ethiopians to be Caucasian. For instance, a journalist from Haiti named Benito Sylvain met Emperor Menelik II in the 19th century, and he hoped that he would become an honorary president of their society, advancing the cause of black people. But Menelik refused, declaring that he was in fact a Caucasian man. But don't think of Caucasian as just being white like in the USA today, as at that time it included everyone from India to England. Then, in Ethiopia and even the Islamic Sultanates in the 1500s, they were facing a sort of migration crisis, as the Oromo people from southern Ethiopia began to migrate north. These Oromo people and the ruling Amharic never fully unified into a single entity, and conflicts between them continue to this day. The Ethiopians weren't even the only Christian kingdom in the region, as just to the north of them you had the Medri Bari, who survived for centuries. But just to the west of them you had more Islamic kingdoms and empires, like Darfur, Wadai and Bornu. Now for Bornu, they were in medieval times a far more powerful empire, but by this point they had become a bit of a rump state, laying in modern-day Chad. Going further west still you had the Hausa states, formed by the largest ethnic group within Africa, the Hausa. Then to the west of them, you had the declining Mali Empire. This empire, like others along the Sahara, grew rich from the trans-Saharan trade. Gold, salt, slaves and the likes passed through these great states, and once upon a time, the ruler of Mali, Mansa Musa, was argued to be the richest man who ever lived. The salt mines here kept food preserved on long journeys, and whole salt mining towns were reliant on this trade to bring them food in the middle of the desert. And just to the south of them they had many gold mines, and I often think that the slave trade somewhat overshadows the West African gold trade. The desire for gold was not just among a few rich Europeans looking to get even richer, but at the beginning of the Age of Exploration it was essential for the survival of the European economies. This is because from 1457 to 1464 there was a bullion famine, and the Europeans were running out of gold and silver. This was in part caused by wars like the 100 Years' War and the huge trade deficit the Europeans had with Asia. So Europeans began exploring and discovered West Africa and their gold mines, and these practically saved Europe. The gold from this region was so well circulated in Europe that this is where you get the name of the old Guinea coins from, because where else but Guinea could you get such a large quantity of gold? As such, there were numerous African states that popped up along the coast here. Benin and Oyo, for instance, had been around since medieval times, while others like Dahomey and Ashanti came about around 16 to 1700. But there's almost too many to mention in this summary. In the far reaches of West Africa, around modern-day Senegal, there was the powerful Jolof Empire. But by the middle of the 16th century, Kayor broke free, and the empire disintegrated into various states. However, as the Europeans began to enter West Africa, stories began to emerge of previous settlers in the region. For instance, in the 1600s, the French claimed that they had evidence of the Normans raiding the West African coast back in the 1300s. This was based on documents which have now disappeared, and the alleged testimony of an 130-year-old Guinea man. He apparently mentioned a French battery in the region, but without those original documents, it's impossible to know if this was based on any truth. Another story came from the Genoese, who had their own explorers in medieval times and the early modern period. The most well-known was of course Columbus, but there was also the Vivaldi brothers, who tried to circumnavigate Africa way back in the 13th century. They however disappeared en route, but Antoniotto Usodomari, a later explorer writing over 150 years later, claimed to have found their descendants. Now Usodomari was an early traveller in Africa, hoping to gain funding for future expeditions. So his reports are often filled with exaggerations and lies. For instance, he wrote of the incredibly rich lands of Prester John along the Gambia River, and, weirdly, a group of people speaking the Genoese dialect. So, apparently, the great-great-grandchildren of the Vivaldi brothers. Now, these medieval explorers may not have made it to West Africa, but ancient people did. The Phoenicians, for instance, explored the area, and Hanno the Navigator even tried to enslave gorillas way back in the 5th century BC. But even though successful trade stopped in medieval times, that's not to say that Europe was completely cut off from West Africa. Obviously the gold found its way from West Africa to Europe, but some strange items might have travelled the other way. Like in the 19th century, the British took over Ashanti, and discovered a ewer dating back to the 1300s. It was inscribed with the English royal seal of the time, and had English writing along the side. So it was clearly made in Plantagenet, England. But how it arrived there remains a mystery. Did it come with slave traders later on in the 18th century, or did it embark on a great medieval journey, being traded with people from Spain, Morocco, Mali and the likes, before finding its new home in the Ashanti Kingdom? It's really hard to know. Now, back in West Africa, there was a powerful empire just to the east of Senegal, the Songhai Empire. They had largely drove the Mali Empire into decline, and took the city of Timbuktu from them. But the Songhai Empire had all but collapsed by the 1600s, and their defeat didn't come at the hands of the Europeans, but Morocco. The Moroccans of Northern Africa in 1578 had fought back a Portuguese invasion, and their new sultan, Ahmad al-Mansur, launched an invasion south and crushed the Songhai. The Moroccans at this point were so powerful that they were seen as a potential ally for the Tudor dynasty, and even the French, who hoped to fight against their mutual enemy of Spain. Plus, the Moroccans were so convinced that they could defeat the Spanish that al-Mansur planned on how to divide up the Spanish colonies in the Americas. However, their rule over West Africa didn't last long. The logistics of maintaining such a large empire across the Sahara proved to be too hard, especially after plague swept through the region, killing al-Mansur and weakening the kingdom. So they retreated back north just a couple decades later. And this brings me to one of the most forgotten colonizers of Africa, the Muslims of the north. After the Ottomans defeated the Mamluks in the early 1500s, they annexed Egypt, and this in turn opened their path to taking coastal Libya, Algeria and Tunisia. These would later become the Barbary States, which infamously would launch pirate attacks on ships passing through the Mediterranean Sea. And if any nation wanted safe passage, they'd have to pay the respective countries tribute. Many Europeans would join the ranks of these pirates, notably Jan Soon, a Dutch pirate who wanted to attack their Spanish enemy. Under his command, the pirates would launch raids as far north as Iceland, where they captured hundreds of people in the 1620s. These people, like many Europeans at that time, were then brought back to the Barbary States and sold as slaves. Now, this slave trade at its height from around 1580 to 1680 probably saw close to 1 million Europeans enslaved and brought to North African states. But if you were to add this number to the number of Christians enslaved by the Ottomans to fill in the ranks of the Janissaries and the likes, the number would of course be a lot higher. Also, during this period, the pirates temporarily took over the English island of Lundy near Bristol, while back in Morocco, they formed their own republic, the Republic of Salih. Among the population of this republic, there were many Christian converts to Islam like Jan Soon, plus there were many Muslims who were forcibly evicted from Spain in the decades prior, and also a collection of Jewish pirates who also wanted some revenge against the Spanish for kicking them out of their home. The Ottomans and the Muslim pirates were therefore the most dominant force in North Africa, but the Ottomans also began looking further south for land and expanded along the Red Sea. For instance, back in 1557, they seized Massawa in modern-day Eritrea, and it was from there that they got involved in the war between Adal, the Ethiopians, and the Portuguese. Plus, in North Africa, there were also a number of European colonies. The Portuguese tried numerous times to invade Morocco, and were sometimes successful in establishing bases along the coast. Most of these were reclaimed by the Moroccans, but there is one interesting tale in there. When Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess, married King Charles II of England in 1662, she gave Tangier to the English as part of the dowry. This dowry also included Bombay, which set British expansion in India in motion. So the same thing could have happened in Tangier, with English expanding into North Africa. But the English Protestants already suspected that Charles was a Catholic, and there was a larger number of Catholics garrisoning the town, so they later had the fortifications destroyed and left Morocco. Also, back in the 1500s, the Spanish were able to take over quite a lot of important towns along the North African coast. For instance, they took over Tripoli in 1510, and gave it to the Knights of St. John in Malta. Algiers was also temporarily occupied by them, and Tunis was made a Spanish puppet, and so too was Jerba. They lost most of these to the Ottomans later on. However, to this day, the Spanish still hold on to some of their North African possessions, Melilla and Ceuta. So you had the Portuguese, Spanish and English in North Africa. Plus there was a very small French attempt as well, as they set up a fort called the Bastion of France in Annaba. There they hoped, like many, to exploit the coral trade in the region, but very little came from this colony. The largest coral traders at that time were the Italian Genoese, who held Tabarka in modern-day Tunisia all the way until the 18th century. However, European, or at least Christian, attempts to take over North Africa go back centuries. For instance, way back in the 12th century, the city of Pisa attacked Annaba, while the Sicilians held on to Jerba sporadically from the 12th to the 15th centuries. In fact, when the Normans ruled Sicily, they launched the Mahdia campaigns in the 11th century and took over large sections of Libya, Tunisia and Algeria. They controlled so much land that the Norman rulers took the title of the King of Africa, and ruled over the area until the Almohad Caliphate kicked them out. Anyway, as Europeans began to grow more in wealth, they too looked to create their own colonial empires, and most of them arrived on the west coast. After all, this place was rich in gold, and many of them were looking to get involved in the growing slave market. In particular, the Gold Coast, or modern-day Ghana, saw a great number of Europeans arrive. But these Europeans, like in other regions, were not controlled by the governments of each country, but they were rather private trading companies. So just like the Virginia Company in America, or the numerous East India Companies, there was also groups like the English African Company of Merchants, or the Guinea Company. So in West Africa, there were of course the English and the Dutch, who were by this point setting up colonies around the world. But there were also Danish and Swedish colonies, plus a short-lived Prussian attempt which lasted from 1682 to 1721. But possibly the most obscure colonial power was Courland. This was a small vassal state of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth located in modern-day Latvia, but the population was a mix of local Baltic people, Polish and many Germans, who had arrived there during the Northern Crusades. They set up a colony on the Gold Coast from 1651 to 1661, however they also had a colony over in Senegal and had a Caribbean colony on the island of Tobago. So the language of many African countries could well have been German or even Swedish had things gone differently. But again, although this is a gross oversimplification, many of these countries would become distracted or indebted due to wars in Europe, and many of them would go on to sell their colonies to the Dutch or English. On the other hand, the Danes held on to colonies in West Africa and the Caribbean until the middle of the 19th century, but since the abolition of slavery, many of their settlements were abandoned and eventually sold off. Then as we move into the late 17th century, the Dutch were on the decline, and in their place, the French appeared as a power in the colonial game. For instance, they seized Gorée from the Dutch. This island, by the way, has a bit of a controversial history, as it is often claimed to be one of the major hubs of the transatlantic slave trade, but this has been disputed in recent years. Now this is because less than 5% of the 12 million slaves who crossed the Atlantic are said to have set off from the Senegambia region. Then even a smaller percent of them would have arrived at Gorée. So compared to other regions, this 5% is pretty low. The Gold Coast, for instance, sent over 10% of the slaves, the Bight of Benin over 20%, and by far the largest number arrived from the area around Congo and Angola, with close to 40%. This, by the way, makes quite a bit of sense, as this is the region in which the Portuguese largely operated, and most slaves were not sent to the Caribbean or the United States, but in fact Brazil. Close to 5 million arrived in Brazil, compared to 2 million in the British Caribbean, 1 million in the French Caribbean and Spanish Americas, and 500,000 in the Dutch Americas and modern-day United States respectively. Plus, it should also be said that over 1 million of those who left Africa never made it across the Atlantic at all. But now we're entering the slave trade, and this is another thing that seems to be completely misunderstood by many. On the one hand, it is said that Europeans were going out capturing the slaves themselves, while on the other, it is often said that the Africans were the biggest traders of slaves. But in truth, the situation was far more complicated, as you would expect. To try and simplify the situation, the slave trade was of course around long before the Europeans arrived. Muslim traders had been taking slaves across the Sahara, or the more regular route for slaves was via ports like Zanzibar. There were in fact so many African slaves in the Muslim world that there were huge slave rebellions. For instance, there was the Zanj rebellion in 9th century Iraq, which allegedly saw hundreds of thousands of men involved. The Islamic slave trade in Africa continued way until the 20th century, and in some cases like in modern-day Libya or Mauritania, well into the 21st century. Plus, this slave trade would be a major justification for the Europeans to begin taking colonies in Africa. But I'll get onto that in later videos. And as a bit of a side note, although not Islamic, the Ethiopian slave trade would be used as a justification by Mussolini to invade the country in the 1930s. But anyway, onto the European slave trade. Now, some African kingdoms did engage in the trade, but not all of them. Other nations were completely torn apart by it, as their neighbours fought more aggressive campaigns against them, solely to capture slaves to sell to the Europeans or to keep to themselves. While, on the reverse, some nations and people flourished due to the slave trade. The Oyo Empire, for instance, launched campaigns to capture slaves, and sometimes even campaigns of conquest. They would also demand tribute from conquered people in the form of slaves, which they, in turn, sold to buy European guns, and the cycle continued. Nearby, Dahomey also had a largely slave-based economy. In the 18th century, the King of Dahomey even sent a diplomatic mission to Brazil, hoping to encourage further trade. And they were also one of the first nations to recognize Brazilian independence on that basis. But because it was forced to give male slaves to Oyo as tribute every year, they decided to create an all-female military unit, named the Dahomey Amazons. These Amazons would often go on slave raids themselves, and during some festivities, hold mock battles showing them capturing male slaves. These female soldiers actually continued to be a powerful force in West Africa until the 19th century, and were present in the war against the French. Further east, some Aro people moved towards the coast, and set up their own confederacy in order to take advantage of the slave trade. While down south in Angola, there were the Imbangala, who would later form the Kasanji Kingdom, but they were initially marauders and mercenaries. They would attack settlements, capture slaves, and, according to some accounts, fill their ranks with captured kids. Plus there are reports of them cannibalizing their victims, and forcing their new recruits to eat human meat. They therefore provided a far better slave trading partner for the Portuguese, rather than the nearby Kingdom of Congo. This is because the Congolese would often try to limit the number of slaves that the Portuguese exported, sometimes try to cut off trade altogether, and they even gave refuge to runaway slaves. So some nations were keen traders while others were not. Plus, like with the Islamic trade in East Africa, the transatlantic slave trade made some people incredibly rich, and allowed some kingdoms to flourish. But it mainly created a state of lawlessness, as warfare was near constant. Agriculture suffered as fields were left destroyed, and many young people of working or fighting age were taken from their homes to be sent to nearby kingdoms, or over to the Middle East or the Americas. There was, however, one other major hub for slaves that I've not mentioned, and that's Madagascar, where over 5% of slaves in the Americas came from. But on Madagascar, the population there was completely different to the rest of Africa. Obviously they were divided by the sea, but the original settlers didn't come from Africa at all. They came from Southeast Asia and were ethnically Austronesian. This means they had more in common with the Maori of New Zealand or the Hawaiians, rather than the Kenyans and the Nigerians. They first came from across the Indian Ocean around 500 AD, but soon afterwards, Muslim traders also began arriving, bringing their religion with them. Then, allegedly, more Austronesians crossed the Indian Ocean a couple centuries later, followed in the 9th century by the Bantus who came from mainland Africa. The English, French and Portuguese all tried to set up colonies on the island, but disease and pretty fierce locals meant they didn't survive longer than a couple of decades. But the French were able to establish bases on nearby islands like Réunion and Mauritius in the middle of the 1600s. As for the locals, they set up the Marina Kingdom. This kingdom would expand to take over most of the island, until the 19th century, when they were conquered by the French. But due to the numerous races that lived on the island, they would organize their society into a caste system of sorts. At the top were the Marina people, the Highlanders. They were known as the Andriana, and as you'd expect, they filled the positions of power, and were seen as more Austronesian in appearance. Below them were other people who spoke the local language of Malagasy, but were absorbed into the kingdom later on. These were called the Hova, and were the free commoners, while below them were the Andivo, slaves which were brought into the country in large numbers to work on the plantations. They were bought from the French and Arabs primarily, who brought them from Mozambique and the East African coast. So similar to the United States, it was quite a racially based form of slavery, and according to a recent UN report, there was still a large amount of discrimination against this slave caste. Meanwhile, there were allegedly stranger colonies set up on Madagascar by pirates. Although piracy is far more famous over in the Caribbean, many pirates in the 17th century began to terrorize the Indian Ocean. Captain Kidd, for instance, turned pirate after being tasked with trying to catch pirates off the coast of Madagascar, which was a great place for looting the treasures being brought back from India. One of the pirates who made a name for himself was Henry Every. He captured a ship belonging to the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, and this led to possibly the world's first ever manhunt. Pirates like Adam Baldridge set up bases around Madagascar, like on the island of St. Mary's, plus there was a somewhat mythical colony called Libertatia, where pirates would go to war against oppressors and defend people's rights. However, many historians question whether or not it really existed. As we enter the 18th century, there wasn't really a great deal of change in terms of colonization. For instance, during the 7 Years' War, the British took French posts in Senegal, but they were given back to the French shortly afterwards. Most colonial efforts at this time were still focused on the Americas, which was far easier to settle in, or over in India, home to great riches and cities. But Spain did enter Africa as they agreed to hand the Portuguese land in South America in return for Spanish Guinea, modern-day Equatorial Guinea, but Spanish influence in Africa below the Sahara will largely just keep to this area. In the south, the Dutch settlers began to form their own unique culture, and these Boers, or Afrikaners, began to launch treks into the interior of South Africa. Over in London, the African Association was set up in the last years of the century, aimed at exploring the continent further. They sent Mungo Park to Timbuktu, but by then it was a shadow of its former self. Ever since the Moroccan invasions, the city had been left weakened, and it had been invaded by Tuareg tribes a couple of times. Plus, the increase in transatlantic slave trade meant that it had lost its strategic importance as a trading centre, as money began to move further towards the coast. This was a pretty recurring theme across the continent, as the 18th century saw the demise of many once powerful nations. The Kingdom of Congo, for instance, was stuck in a near-endless fight for the throne, while over in Ethiopia, there was the Age of Princes, when the country was divided between various lords and the emperor had no real power. This in turn led to various ethnic clashes and, ultimately, the weakening of the empire. To the north of them, the old Christian Nubian states of Makuria had been defeated, but the new Muslim states of Darfur, Wadai and Funj fought a number of wars against each other during the 18th century. Plus, they also faced droughts which lasted for years, the power of the monarchs began to erode, and Ethiopian raids plundered a great deal of wealth. So by the beginning of the 19th century, the palace of Sanaa in the Funj Sultanate was essentially in ruin. Yet there was one peculiar state stuck among the Christians and Muslims in this area, the Shilluk Kingdom. Here their religion was based around their kings, and their capital was Fashoda, a place that would gain a great deal of fame during the scramble for Africa. In the southeast, the Kingdom of Mutapa faced numerous civil wars, and competing factions constantly called on the Portuguese for aid. The Portuguese were obviously willing to participate, and the kingdom just disintegrated in that century. But on the Portuguese, they were able to expand their holdings in Africa at the expense of kingdoms like Congo. However, Portugal itself was weakening, so they had very little direct rule over much of the land they took over. Otherwise, the Portuguese also aided in the rise of the Zulu kingdom in nearby South Africa. This is because they brought maize over from the Americas, and it had spread inland by the middle of the 18th century. This led to a huge increase in population in the region and spurred on the desire to seize arable land, which had dramatically increased in importance due to the crop. So the Zulu, along with other Bantu people, began to set up their own kingdoms in the decades following this. Over in the west of Africa, a number of palace coups weakened the Oyo Empire, and there was also the fall of the Great Falu Empire to an altogether new threat, jihadists. These jihads began in the 1720s and were largely launched by the Fula people, who today can be found in nearly every West African country. They were inspired to launch jihads by the Turodbi, a group of clerics whose origins are not altogether that clear. They had in fact begun to launch jihads at the end of the 17th century, but they really became significant in the 18th, starting with Karamoko Alpha's conquest of Futa Jalon. They destroyed many sacred animist objects belonging to the locals, including a ceremonial drum, and made a great deal of money from selling the slaves onto the Europeans. But, just like the Christians in Europe, they refused to sell Muslim slaves, and even banned the French from using the rivers in their kingdoms for transporting Muslim slaves. Their success in turn led to further jihadist states being formed across West Africa, like Futa Toro, which was founded in 1776 at the expense of the Great Fula Empire. Then, in the early 19th century, they took over Timbuktu and formed the Messina Empire. But their greatest state was probably the Sokoto Caliphate. This caliphate conquered the Hausa kingdoms and drove back the Bornu Empire, which was also largely Islamic, and the Sokoto Caliphate ruled over the region until the very early 20th century. Plus, in the north, The 18th century was also a bit of a disaster for the Moroccans. Meanwhile, up in the north, the Moroccans, the people that once tried to create a huge West African empire, were also on the decline. Under Ismail ibn Sharif, the country's various tribes and ethnicities were brought under central control in the late 17th century, and he even managed to retake many Spanish towns in the region, like Madilla and Asila. Then, to further weaken the Europeans, he sponsored pirate attacks against them, but the various divisions were never fully bridged. This is evidenced by the creation of the Black Guard, a personal guard made up entirely of sub-Saharan African slaves. They were seen as more loyal than any of the various people in Morocco, and were tasked with collecting taxes, crushing rebellions and the likes. But when Ismail died in 1727, the country began to unravel and descend into anarchy for the following decades. Their neighbours to the east, the Ottomans, were also on the decline in the 18th century. Although their decline in Europe is more well known, they had been losing control of North Africa ever since the beginning of the 1700s. For instance, in Tripolitania, a janissary named Ahmed Karamanli murdered the Ottoman ruler of the region in 1711, and he took power for himself. Towards the end of the century, a Turkish officer named Ali Pasha tried to restore Ottoman control through a coup of his own, but the civil war of the 1790s saw the Karamanli dynasty re-establish their authority. The same thing happened in Tunis, with Al-Hussein-ibn Ali, who took power in 1705, and in Algiers, where Baba Ali Chok ousted the Ottoman officials. Plus, on Algiers, they started demanding higher tributes from the European powers, and when this was refused, they actually started wars against them. So long before the Barbary Wars of the 19th century, Baba declared war on the Dutch in 1715, and then in 1769, the Danes declared war on Algiers. The Algerians responded by enslaving the crew on a number of Danish ships, and refused to surrender despite the threat of the city being bombarded. And, fortunately for them at least, many Danish soldiers died of typhoid during the conflict, meaning the Algerians defeated the Danes. The Spanish would then declare war in the 1770s to stop further Algerian raids. But despite having their cities heavily bombarded, the Algerians still refused to surrender, and a poorly planned Spanish assault on Algiers was driven back. So, once again, the Algerians were successful. But their luck would eventually run out in a couple of decades, when the Americans under Thomas Jefferson, and also the British, would defeat them. And just at the end of the century, further east still, Napoleon invaded Egypt. Although he was defeated and left the region, this set off a huge chain reaction which completely changed the course of African history. This is because Egypt, although under Ottoman control, had been governed by the Mamluks for centuries. This was a military caste made up of slaves brought from the Caucasus, the Balkans and the likes. So the ruling elite of Egypt was a different ethnicity to the larger Arab population. But now they had been defeated by Napoleon, which resulted in a power vacuum. Eventually a man who may well have been Albanian took over. He was Muhammad Ali, and his dynasty would rule Egypt virtually independently of the Ottomans. But his dynasty would change the world. They created their own empire, built the Suez Canal, and fell into debt, which brought the British into the country, and this led to the Mahdist Wars. So I'll look at the very beginnings of the scramble in the next episode and leave it here for now, at the end of the 18th century, where we have a power vacuum in Egypt, declining powers in all parts of the continent, jihadist states in the west, slave trading kingdoms like Ashanti Dahomey in Madagascar, Arab rule in the east, and a collection of very small European colonies around the coast. But then, although often ignored, the Napoleonic Wars and its aftermath brought about a number of changes in Africa. Notably, the British entered South Africa, the Americans defeated the Barbary states, the British fought the Ashanti, and the government took direct control of the West African colonies. Then the restored French monarchy invaded Algeria, and probably most importantly, for many African kingdoms, slavery was abolished. This meant the kingdoms that emerged in the 17th and 18th century, those that built their economy on the slave trade, were left economically crippled, and this weakened the continent's major powers even further. Although the African continent had a number of powerful kingdoms in the early modern period like Congo, Ethiopia, Mutapa and Morocco, by the end of the 18th century, most of them had been left weakened by civil wars, foreign intervention and constant warfare. Many of these wars were spurred on by the demand for slaves, But then the continent would completely change with the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars, starting with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. At that time, Egypt was ruled by the Ottomans, but that was just another power on the decline in the 18th century, and by then the Barbary states of North Africa were acting independent of their rule. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the Mamluks had largely ran the country for centuries. This was a military caste made up of slaves brought from the Caucasus, Balkans and the likes. So the ruling elite of Egypt was a different ethnicity to the larger Arab population. This meant when Napoleon invaded Egypt, he largely fought the Mamluks and their armies, and despite some early victories, Royal Navy blockades and disease, forced Napoleon to flee. But the defeats of the Mamluks had created a power vacuum in the country, as power was then fought over between the Mamluks, Turkish governor sent by the Ottomans, and Muhammad Ali, a leader of Albanian troops that the Ottomans sent to fight the French. During the following years of chaos, Muhammad Ali was successful in defeating the Mamluks, cementing his control, and even expanding Egypt's borders. His first war was against a new sect of Islam in Saudi Arabia, named the Wahhabis. After this war, he invited the remaining Mamluks to celebrate, but as they entered the city, they were massacred. Those who survived by remaining in the countryside fled south to Sudan, but Muhammad Ali pursued them in 1820. This began Egypt's conquest of Sudan. However, Muhammad Ali had another reason for the conquest. As he wrote, "You are aware that the end of all our effort and this expense is to procure Negroes." And in this he was successful. The kingdom of Funj and the surrounding area were conquered by only 10,000 men or so, demonstrating to the world how a small, well-trained force using modern weapons can defeat a whole kingdom. After this, the Egyptians would launch further campaigns of conquest, taking Kassala, Fashoda, Suakin, Equatoria and Darfur by 1874. But one country they didn't conquer was Ethiopia. Meanwhile, Muhammad Ali's dynasty would fight wars against the Ottomans, and for a short while, they even took Syria. So they could be seen as the first true colonizers of Africa, who didn't just seek trading posts, but large stretches of land. Plus, even though his dynasty would remain officially under Ottoman control, they virtually acted independent, and Egypt under their rule would try to rapidly modernize. For instance, the Suez Canal would be built, which would bring European traders and colonizers into East Africa. However, the Egyptian wars and modernization plunged them into debt, and this led to the British entering the country, the Mahdist Wars, and a great deal more. But going back to the turn of the 19th century, there were a few changes that occurred during the Napoleonic Wars. For instance, the British took Mauritius from the French, but more importantly, there was the formation of the Zulu Kingdom, formed by Shaka Zulu, and Bantu people who migrated south. Simultaneously, the British took the Dutch colony in South Africa, pushing the Dutch Boers on their Great Trek in 1836 to establish their own states. This meant that there was a three-way power struggle between the Boers, the British and the Zulu. However, these three powers obviously didn't just pop into being peacefully. They conquered and ruled over a number of different races. The British, for instance, went to war almost immediately against the Xhosa people. The first confrontation between them took place in the 1810s, when the Xhosa occupied the Zerveld region, which had acted as a buffer, but they were promptly driven out of it. There was another war that decade beginning in 1818, which was largely led by a Xhosa prophet named Makana Ntxeli. Now he allegedly had the power to turn bullets into water and hoped to unite the Xhosa against the British, who had seized thousands of cattle belonging to them. But the British had the support of the San people, and together they defeated the Xhosa. As for Makana, he became the first person to be sentenced to prison on Robben Island, which became the infamous site of Nelson Mandela's imprisonment. In the intervening years, thousands of British settlers arrived in South Africa, while the Xhosa angered the Boers with their cattle raids. So Piet Retief sent his Boer commandos on punitive expeditions against them, while the Sixth Xhosa War erupted in 1834. It was another speedy victory for the British, who took more land and even imprisoned King Hintsa. However, while negotiating the payment for stolen cattle, the king tried to escape and was killed in the chase. However, despite this victory, Britain's inability to protect Boer settlers convinced them to take matters into their own hands and thus embark on the Great Trek north. However, tensions between the British and the Boers had been running high for some time. Obviously, English became the official language, and British laws and culture alienated the Boers. But what possibly angered them the most was Britain's racial policies. For instance, back in 1815, the British declared the natives of South Africa would be citizens and share the same rights. The British then outlawed slavery in the region in 1834, freeing 30,000 or so African slaves. At that time, it is believed over 90% of Boers in some regions like Stellenbosch owned slaves, so this, along with British weakness during the Xhosa cattle raids, prompted the Boers to set off north and establish their own republics. These treks lasted a couple of years, and only around 6,000 people, or 1/5 of the Dutch population, made the journey, and they faced attacks from all sides. The Matabele, for instance, attacked them early on, but in 1836 at the Battle of Wegkop, just 35 Boers held off an attack from over 5,000 Matabele warriors. The following punitive attacks pushed the Matabele out of the region and into Zimbabwe, where most of them live today. But their arrival came at the cost of the Shona people, and tensions between these communities continue to this day. But probably the worst attacks came from the Zulu. For instance, in 1838, Piet Retief met with Dingane, the Zulu king, to discuss a land treaty and watch a ceremonial performance. However, it was a trap, and 100 people, including Retief, were massacred. This was followed up with a number of other massacres like the Winene massacre, in which over 500 Boers were killed. So the Boers could well have been destroyed and chased out of their new land. But the betrayal and massacres encouraged them to meet the Zulu at the Battle of Blood River in late 1838. In this battle they were victorious and they set up the Republic of Natalia, while the Zulus descended into civil wars, as the Boers, under Pretorius, helped Mpande remove his brother Dingane from power. But the Boers were not allowed to remain in Natalia for long, as the British moved troops in there in 1842 and forced them out. So other Boer republics were established like at Klip River, before, in the 1850s, the Orange Free State and Transvaal were established. But the Boers weren't the only people establishing new republics, as there was also the Grieke, a group of mixed-race people who set up their own republics, like Griekenland East and West in the 1860s, centered around mining areas. Then finally onto the Zulus, who probably launched the most destructive campaigns in the region. From around 1815 to 1840, the Zulus launched their wars of expansion, and this period has been called Umfekane by the original inhabitants. This word has many meanings, but think of it as meaning a scattering of people, as people were forced off their land, and it is estimated that over 1 million people were killed. People fled in every direction and established their own kingdoms and states. For instance, after the defeat of Undwandwe Shoshangani, he went to Mozambique and set up the Gaza Empire. The Fengu people, on the other hand, arrived in Xhosa land, putting further strain on their resources, and if you look at a map of South Africa today, you will see a tiny nation trapped inside it. This is Lesotho. The origins of this country date back to this period, as Moshoeshoe I took his Sotho people into the mountains to escape the Zulu wars. The other tiny nation in this region is Swaziland, or Eswatini, which still has a monarchy, but their monarchy goes back to the middle of the 18th century. Beforehand, the Swazi were living around Delgoa Bay in Mozambique, but they settled in the area that they are today, under the leadership of Dlamini III, and they are quite unique in not being affected by the Zulu wars. To the east of them, the Portuguese still continue to rule Mozambique, but their power was largely on the wane by now, and a lot of trade along the east coast was now being conducted by the Omani people who ruled in Zanzibar. Yet, like the Grieke in South Africa, there was a collection of mixed-race people on their borders, who became incredibly influential in the region, often serving as intermediaries between the two groups of people. They, however, acted more like feudal lords, running large estates or prazos, which they were given in exchange for an annual fee. Their huge estates were protected by slave soldiers known as Chikundu, and some families owned a few thousand of them. Some of these families would also become somewhat Africanized, and even became chiefs of local tribes. In later decades, the Portuguese would try to bring them back under their control, especially after David Livingstone began exploring the region. But some of these families, like the De Cruz family, were able to drive them back in 1868. David Livingstone, by the way, was a Scottish missionary who, largely on his own accord, began exploring Africa in the middle of the century. From South Africa, he journeyed north and established a mission as far away as Blantyre in modern-day Malawi. From the 1840s to the 1860s, he travelled around Africa and made some pretty strange alliances in the process. For instance, the Makololo travelled with him from Zambia to Malawi, and they would later fight alongside the British. During it all, he reported all of his findings back to the Europeans, including the resources of the continent and the Arab massacres of Africans, plus the ongoing slave trade. But very few cared initially. He eventually disappeared in 1869, and Henry Morton Stanley was sent out to find him. They met on the shores of Lake Tanganyika in 1871 with the famous words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." On Stanley, he was also struggling to find funding for exploration, and he often depended on newspapers rather than his own government. Eventually he relented and went to Leopold II of Belgium, the only European leader eager to colonize the area. But he would later be horrified to find out Leopold's intentions. Now these might be two of the most famous explorers, but they were far from the first. The Scottish in particular had a number of explorers around Africa, like MacGregor Laird, who travelled along the Niger in the 1830s, and Alexander Gordon Laing, who travelled to Timbuktu back in the 1820s. The Irish-born Frenchman, Antoine Thomas de Aberdeen, explored Ethiopia in the 1830s, and Richard Francis Burton, a peculiar explorer, tried to find the source of the Nile. But Burton also went to Mecca dressed as a Muslim, gained the nickname Ruffian Dick for getting into fights, and collected measurements of people's penises wherever he went. Yet he was probably inspired by a much earlier explorer, Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, a Swiss explorer who went on the Hajj, rediscovered incredibly famous sites like Petra and Abu Simbel in the 1820s, but ultimately was prevented from travelling beyond Egypt by the local authorities. There was also some German explorers like Heinrich Barth, who explored the Sahara and West Africa, and the Latvian-born German George August Schweinfurt, who explored Sudan. But once again, these were largely privately funded expeditions, led by botanists or missionaries, and they really didn't come from the colonial ambitions of any European government, at least before the 1870s. So British explorers were journeying out of South Africa, while they continued to fight against the Xhosa. These wars went until the 1870s, and one of the strangest episodes of these wars was the cattle-killing movement of the 1850s. This began when a 16-year-old prophetess claimed that she had spoken with the Xhosa ancestors, and they promised to aid them drive the Europeans into the sea. But they were only willing to help the living Xhosa if they destroyed all of their current means of substance. So they burnt down their own crops and killed thousands of cattle. Even the leaders began to demand people do it. But when the day of reckoning was supposed to come in 1858, obviously they were disappointed, and thousands died of starvation. Meanwhile, before the scramble, the British were fighting elsewhere in Africa. Going back to the beginning of the century, in the West, the British were getting involved in wars along the Gold Coast, because, just like in the Americas, Europeans would often align with different tribes or nations. There, the British often aided the Fanti Confederacy, while the Dutch, historically, helped the far more powerful Ashanti Kingdom. The Fanti, by the way, also flew Asafo flags in battle, something very similar to a regimental flag, many of which featured a Union Jack. So the British, albeit in a very minor way, got involved in the Ashanti-Fanti War of 1806. Then the Ashanti fought the Fanti again in 1811, and won again. But the Kingdom of Ashanti's most ambitious war of conquest came in 1814, when they conquered large sections of the Gold Coast with an army of 20,000 men, and threatened to remove the Europeans from the area. So in 1817, the British African Company of Merchants signed a treaty of friendship with them, recognising their recent conquests. However, the British African Company of Merchants was soon dissolved in 1821, and the British government took control of the West African colonies. Shortly afterwards, in 1823, the Ashanti killed soldiers in the British Royal African Regiment, leading to the First Anglo-Ashanti War. During this war, the British were actually defeated in early battles, and their commander, Charles McCarthy, was killed and his skull was turned into a cup, and his heart was allegedly eaten. But during that fatal battle, only 4 crates of supplies were brought to the front line, 3 of which only contained macaroni. Therefore, the 500 people in the British Army were doomed against the 10,000 Ashanti. So to counterattack, the British brought Congreve rockets into the region and drove the Ashanti back, securing a great deal of the Gold Coast, either directly under their control or under the control of their allies like the Fanti. Plus, it should also be said that the African Company of Merchants was also dissolved because they were still allegedly trading in slaves. something that was banned in 1807. This ban was taken incredibly seriously by the British, as they also created the West African Squadron, which patrolled the seas in the area, hoping to stop slave ships. To further help in this effort, they formed a new base in Banjul in 1816, and this would be the basis of the Gambia in the following decades. However, only 20 ships patrolled the entire West African coast, so maybe only 10% of ships were stopped crossing the Atlantic, and it's believed that thousands of slaves were just thrown overboard as the slavers didn't want to pay the fines to the British. Still, it is believed over 150,000 slaves were liberated in these decades and were brought back to Africa, while in Africa, this ban on slavery had major consequences. The powers that had emerged over the last couple hundred years had based their economies on the export of slaves, along with other items like palm oil and the likes. So the ban weakened their states, and it was met with outrage by many African leaders, like the King of Bonny in Nigeria, who wrote to the British saying, "We think this trade must go on. They say that your country, however great, can never stop a trade ordained by God himself." Plus, the ban did little to stop the trade of slaves within Africa. The Igbo people, for instance, continued trading, while the Dahomey used slaves as a display of wealth and prestige. As King Gezo of Dahomey wrote in the 1840s, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of their wealth. The mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery." These kingdoms continue to find some markets to export to, primarily Brazil, which only abolished slavery in 1888. Plus, there was also still the option of selling to Islamic slave traders, while within Africa, Mauritania only abolished slavery in 1981, and they still had slaveholders in the 21st century. Otherwise, the abolition of slavery made colonies in Africa far less profitable. As mentioned before, this led to nations like Denmark selling their colonies in the 19th century. Then things became more complicated, as many of the slaves who were freed migrated to Nigeria beginning in the 1830s, where they were called the Saro people. Some of these people, as they migrated, were just enslaved again though, or they were used as some sort of political tool. For instance, the ruler of Lagos, a major slave trading port, was Oba Akitoye. He was willing to ban slavery across his state in order to secure British support, but this was of course unpopular among the slave owners and traders, so they rebelled and placed his brother Kosoko on the throne. In exile, he appealed to the British for help, and they obliged in 1851, on the assurance that he would ban the slave trade. A fleet was dispatched to Lagos, they bombarded the city, and installed Akitoye on the throne. But he died shortly afterwards, and there was another power struggle between his son, Dosunmu, and Kosoko. Then there was another problem for Britain. The French had been forming trade agreements with nearby rulers like Soji, the king of Porto Novo, who was obviously worried about British military action. The rulers of Lagos also flirted with the idea of accepting French protection, and this convinced Lord Palmerston to act before the French did. So in 1861, British ships arrived once again, and Lagos became a British protectorate, thus establishing a foothold in what would become Nigeria. This also put the British remarkably close to one of the oldest kingdoms in Africa, the Kingdom of Benin, which is most famous for their remarkably large capital city and the huge walls defending it. In fact, back in the 1600s, many European explorers said that the city was equal in size to some of their own cities back home. But large walls, or at least large gates, were not unique to Benin, as in the north the Hausa states like Kanu, Zazau and Katsina all had huge gates defending their palaces and cities. But back on the coast, the French and local African rulers were obviously angry by British expansion. While the British were supposed to be freeing slaves, they were simultaneously taking fresh colonies in Gambia and Nigeria. So in 1863, Soji of Porto Novo signed an agreement with the French. But the French were not really better in this regard, as just nearby, back in the 1840s, they signed an agreement with the Nzema people of the Ivory Coast. This allowed them to set up a fort in Grand Bassam and expand their influence in the region. But going back to slavery, the British even began to bring freed slaves from across North America and even Europe to their main base in West Africa, Sierra Leone. This colony was home to the infamous Bunce Island, but even when slavery was legal, there was a huge scheme to resettle black people in this area. Many of these black people fought alongside the British in the American Revolution in exchange for their freedom, while others like Olaudah Equiano was able to purchase his freedom in the Caribbean. He, like many others, went to live in England and formed the Sons of Africa group, aimed at abolishing the slave trade. Meanwhile, white abolitionists set up the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor. They believed that sending the poor black people from Canada or the UK back to Africa would help relieve their poverty. But this plan also got support from many racists who hoped to remove black people from their countries. Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger said they should be sent somewhere and be no longer suffered to infest the streets of London. So with government approval, former slaves from England and Nova Scotia were resettled in Sierra Leone, where they founded the city of Freetown. On arrival, they had many rights and even elected their officials, but they were given very few supplies, faced conflicts with their African neighbours, and back in 1799 they rebelled. To crush the rebellion, the British used Jamaican Maroons. Now these Maroons had escaped from slavery and lived in the countryside of Jamaica, but in the 1790s they also rebelled against the British. Many of them were deported to Canada, but on the outset of the rebellion in Sierra Leone, 500 of them were transported to Africa to crush the rebels. In return, they were given land and became part of the new social elite. So within this new society, there were Maroons, the Nova Scotians as they were called, liberated Africans the West African Squadron had taken from slave ships, and the local people. These groups would rarely get along. For instance, a Maroon leader named Major Jarrett was killed by his liberated African employee. This prompted attacks from both sides until many Maroons fled back across the Atlantic. But over time during the 19th century, these three immigrant groups would begin to merge together into the Creole people of Sierra Leone. They lived in homes that were clearly inspired by their old homes in southern USA, they developed their own language known as Creole, and they even began trading down the West African coast and settling in new countries. Then, just across their eastern border, the country of Liberia had a very similar origin tale. There, the American Colonization Society acquired land from the Gola ruler, named King Peter, in 1821. This land served as a base for the former slaves to arrive in, but from the beginning, they too faced attacks from the locals, specifically the Malinka people. But the liberated slaves in Liberia also had government support from President Monroe, and in his honor, they named their first town Monrovia. Only a few thousand people actually made the trip to Liberia, and of them, less than 2,000 were still alive by 1841, when Joseph Jenkins Roberts declared that the country was independent. However, the history of Liberia took quite a dark turn, as the Americo-Liberians began to emulate the slave owners of Southern America. So their society was based upon segregation, with them at the top, despite never making up more than 5% of the population. Their numbers were bolstered with the arrival of people from the Caribbean in the 1860s, and a mass exodus of former slaves from South Carolina a decade later. This ruling class of Americo-Liberians were criticized as late as the 1920s for still using slave labor, and they kept hold of power until the outbreak of the Civil War in Liberia in 1980. Nevertheless, the independence of Liberia was recognized by the great powers very early on, meaning it was the two countries that was never colonized by the Europeans. However, to compare it to the Ethiopians is a little problematic, as Liberia was seemingly born out of the effort of colonizers, just a different sort of colonizer. Plus, on slavery elsewhere, there was still the threat of Islamic slave raids in Europe thanks to the Barbary states of North Africa at the turn of the 19th century. But the Americans under Thomas Jefferson refused to pay tribute to them, beginning the Barbary Wars. Algiers and Tripoli were bombarded by the American fleet, and then, after the Napoleonic Wars, the British also bombarded Algiers when they massacred Christian slaves. This, as well as more advanced European ships, greatly reduced the power of these once feared states. Then, Algeria would also be the first state in North Africa to fall to the Europeans, specifically the French. The French conquest began in 1827 when Charles X blockaded their capital. The justification behind the blockade, however, was a farce, as it began when the ruler of Algiers demanded the French pay their bills for supplies given to them during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. The French initially refused to respond, but their ambassador was whipped by the Algerians, prompting the blockade. However, this just gave Charles the cause for war that he wanted, as he was keen to find a distraction for the French people. He was, after all, the king, and his unpopular Bourbon dynasty had been restored after the fall of Napoleon. So, to gain public support, he invaded Algeria in 1830. This did little to help Charles though, as he was removed from power during the July Revolution. Nevertheless, the invasion continued, and initially, the French held very little power outside the major cities of Oran, Algiers and Bonnet, so they had to pacify the rest of the region, and to do so, they created the French Foreign Legion in 1831. This had a number of benefits to the new ruler of France, Louis Philippe. For starters, he came to power with the help of French liberals, people who were largely opposed to the Algerian War, so by sending off foreigners, he could appease them. Plus, it also served as a place to throw the old guards of the French kings, like the Swiss guards, who had defended Charles during the July Revolution. So this new Foreign Legion helped the French gradually expand their control in Algeria, and by the middle of the 19th century, they controlled most of the coast, forcing many Algerians into Morocco to organize their resistance. This just resulted in the extremely short Franco-Moroccan War of 1844, which the French won, and their control over Algeria was formally recognized by the Moroccans. Then, in the 1850s, the French launched a further campaign of conquest in Senegal. This could be seen as part of a much larger French effort to expand their empire under their new ruler Napoleon III, who also moved into Southeast Asia and Mexico. But looking at these conflicts as connected is often problematic, and this will be especially true during the Scramble. This is because the governors of various colonies would often act independently of the central government, or were responding to immediate problems. So the campaigns in Senegal really could have begun in the 1820s, after the French colonies were left weakened, after the British took them during the Napoleonic Wars, and only returned them to France if they promised to abolish slavery. The trade in acacia gum therefore began to grow more important as a replacement source of income, as it was extremely important as a dye in the growing textile industry of Europe. But the weakened French outposts in Senegal faced the growing power of the Emirate of Trarza, who often raided their neighbours, the Walu Kingdom. These two, however, were close to uniting through marriage, which would give them control of both banks of the Senegal River, so the French attacked them in 1825 to end this union. Then, fast forward to the 1840s and 1850s, the French companies were building more forts along the banks of the Senegal River, angering the local states. So Trarza united with Walu again, and even their old rivals, the Emirate of Brakna. They launched a united raid on the French port of St. Louis in 1855, but the French responded quickly and successfully and took control of Walu, which had existed for centuries. But the last queen of Walu, Ndate Yale Mbonj, was facing invasions from Muslim states in the north and the French throughout most of her reign, so she really stood very little chance of survival. The French victory then brought them closer to the borders of a new African state, the Tukulur Empire, which had been created by Omar Said Tall. Think of this as an extension of the jihadist states of West Africa, as they were essentially just the unification of the most western ones. Under Omar, they launched an attack on the French in 1857, but were pushed back and the new spheres of influence were recognized. The French were therefore free to start picking off the small kingdoms in Senegal, and quite quickly, a new enemy appeared in the King of Sinai. He attacked the French just 2 years later, but was defeated at the Battle of Logandemi, and he lost some of his provinces. But the wars obviously didn't end there, as the Sinai spent the next decade or so destroying French infrastructure until their king was assassinated by the French in 1871. A very similar fate was in store for the other Senegalese kingdoms, like Kayor, Saloum and Baol. Despite fierce resistance and the occasional jihad, they were all absorbed into French Senegal. However, these wars and raids destroyed much of the farmland and infrastructure of Senegal, leaving the area crippled. But it would become the centre of French West Africa, and the French would later hope to connect it to their new colony on the east coast of Africa in Djibouti. This colony was created back in 1862, when the French bought land around Obok from the Sultan of Afar named Rajita Dini Ahmet. And this brings me right the way back to Egypt, because two events in the 1860s set the stage for the scramble for Africa. As stated before, the Egyptians launched campaigns of conquest in the Sudan, and their wars against the Ottomans in the 1830s split the support of European powers, as France supported Egypt, while Britain and Austria sent ships to help the Ottomans. But largely, the country was free from European ambitions until the outbreak of the American Civil War. As Southern American cotton was not making its way to Europe, the factories in Britain and France were brought to a standstill. Many Brits hoped to enter the war on the Confederate side to end this cotton famine, and the French, who were already active in Mexico, were even more keen. But the Confederates' King Cotton Plan ultimately failed, as the Europeans found another solution. They began to look at Egypt's growing cotton industry, yet to encourage this trade, the Egyptians fell further into debt by building railway lines. However, the American Civil War and this new market made Egypt and Africa as a whole a more attractive option for resources. Then the second great event was the construction of the Suez Canal. Construction began with the French Suez Canal Company, created by Ferdinand de Lesseps. Said, the ruler or the Khedive of Egypt, also invested a lot of money into stocks. Plus, as a bit of a side note, as the French and Egyptians began working together, Said agreed to help Napoleon in his invasion of Mexico, and sent hundreds of Sudanese slaves to fight alongside them. Anyway, as construction was underway, Europeans began to correctly see that East Africa would become incredibly important to international shipping. So this is why the French purchased part of what would become Djibouti several years before the Suez Canal opened. But just across the Red Sea, there was already a British colony at Aden, and this dated back to the 1830s, when the British took the town to serve as a coaling station for their ships on the way to India. Also, nearby, another colonial power joined in the race, the Italians. Their ambitions in East Africa are largely the result of Giuseppe Sapanto's explorations of Ethiopia and his insistence on Italian expansion. So, in 1869, the newly unified Italian kingdom listened to his calls and sent him to purchase land around Assab Bay from the Danakil chiefs. This territory was initially owned by a private company, but it would serve as the foundation of Italian Eritrea. And this brings me on to a crucial part of the history. In the 19th century, Europe saw the creation of a number of new states, all eager to establish colonies. Going back to the July Revolution in France, this inspired another revolution, the Belgian Revolution, against the Dutch rulers. This small country and its new kings, the German Leopold I and his son Leopold II, would try to desperately seek out new colonies. This included the Philippines, Cuba, various Caribbean islands, and even at one point, Texas. But they were only really successful in the Congo. The Italians then came into the picture in the 1860s, and then in 1871, the Prussians defeated the French and created the German Empire. This encouraged both sides to develop colonial empires. For starters, the humiliated French sought to find land and resources outside of Europe, while the Germans wanted their place in the sun. So the arrival of new European powers completely changed the status quo in Africa, prompting the old powers to claim territories that they had previously been uninterested in. But just before I end this episode, I need to highlight developments in one country, and that's Ethiopia. They had been left weakened in the 18th century as various leaders ruled independently of the emperor during their age of princes. However, in the 19th century, a bandit named Sahi Dingil began to gather a large following. He grew so powerful that the empress married off her granddaughter to him. But this did little to help them, as in 1852, he rose up against his in-laws, took the throne, and became Theodoros II. As emperor, he was wary of the growing Egyptian power to the north, so he too tried to rapidly modernize his country. But to do so, he forced European missionaries to produce cannons for him, which were obviously terrible, and he wrote numerous letters to Queen Victoria asking for weapons. But these letters were ignored. This would have seemed strange to him, as he, like the Ethiopians in centuries past, believed an Ethiopian-European alliance could have destroyed the Muslims. However, now the British were invested in Egypt and had very little to gain through an Ethiopian alliance. So Theodoros imprisoned the foreigners in his country and demanded weapons for their release. This was disastrous though, as the British in 1867 sent an army into Ethiopia to free them. Theodoros had very few followers among the various ethnicities, so the British were able to take his capital city while he committed suicide. This created a power vacuum in the country as different factions fought for the newly vacant throne. But eventually Johannes IV would succeed. He would go on to defend Ethiopia against attacks from the Egyptians and even the Mahdists of Sudan. Plus, he would also become a colonizer of sorts, as under his rule, Ethiopia would expand their empire from their homeland in the north to the borders of Kenya in the south. Therefore, the Ethiopians, like the Egyptians, would become the forgotten participants in the scramble for Africa. But that's where I'll leave it. Over the first half of the 19th century, The Americans set up Liberia and defeated the Barbary pirates. Britain expanded their control in South Africa and West Africa. The French took Senegal, Djibouti and Algeria. The Italians entered Eritrea. The Portuguese maintained their hold along the coast. The Egyptians became essentially independent, took Sudan and built the Suez Canal. Boer republics were established in the south, and jihadi states in the west expanded, all of which predate the traditional starting point of the scramble for Africa. By the 1850s, the French had moved into Algeria, took posts in the Ivory Coast, and expanded their holdings in Senegal. Meanwhile, the British expanded their holdings in the west and the south, at the expense of the Xhosa, the Ashanti and the likes. But the greatest colonizers of the early 19th century were the Egyptians, who conquered all of Sudan. And in the 1870s, they even tried to invade Ethiopia, but this was a disaster. Even though some ex-Confederate soldiers were employed to help in the expedition, they were quickly driven back by Ethiopia's new emperor, Johannes IV, in 1876. This campaign, along with previous campaigns, the construction of the Suez Canal, and various other projects, plunged the Egyptians into further debt. Plus, with these defeats, their hold over Massawa fell, and they eventually allowed the Italians to take over. But there was another major event in the world that is often overlooked, that encouraged the British and many Europeans to force the Egyptians to repay their debts and to begin colonizing new lands. This was the Panic of 1873. This, put very simply, was the result of overinvestment in railway lines and some industries. Too many were being constructed and brought in limited returns, so banks began to close down, causing a depression in the United States and Europe, and this depression would last until the 1890s. This, of course, is a very simplistic view of the depression, as other people have put the causes down to different things, like the French war debts caused after their war with Prussia, or even the construction of the Suez Canal. Many argue that this panic led to a rise in protectionist policies, so compare it to the Depression in the 1930s, which saw some countries like Germany and Japan angered at the international markets and financial systems causing depressions, so looked to produce a much more self-sufficient economy through the conquest of land. The same thing could be said here, as the Europeans were producing too many goods which couldn't be sold in a stagnated Western economy. So, like explorer Henry Morton Stanley said when in the Congo, there are 40 million nude people, and the cotton spinners of Manchester are waiting to clothe them. This theory behind the cause of the scramble was developed on by Lenin, who described imperialism as the latest stage of capitalism. But personally, I believe this is too simplistic, as the Europeans largely propped up declining empires elsewhere, like China and the Ottoman Empire. There, a strong and stable government was better for trade, and provided even larger markets without the expenses of direct control. But going back to Egypt, the British were now determined to have their debts repaid after the panic, and along with the French, they sent a commission to oversee the country's finances. But the Egyptians were still officially under Ottoman rule, and had to provide funds to help them in their war against the Russians that decade. Plus, as the British offered diplomatic support for the Ottomans during this war, they were given Cyprus, putting them within striking distance of Egypt. The British interference in Egypt would eventually lead to the Urabi Revolt, but we'll put a pin in Egypt for now, as the 1870s saw further developments elsewhere. In the south, there was a short civil war in the Boer republics of South Africa, which helped Paul Kruger rise to power. But some people sought British protection from the Boers, like Basutoland, which came under British control in 1869, and this would eventually become the nation of Lesotho. Otherwise, a group of mixed-race people known as the Griqua set up their own republics like at Klipdrift. There, after the discovery of diamonds, thousands of British migrants would appear, and they too would fall under British protection, putting Britain firmly on the borders of the Boer republics. So the Panic of 1873 also encouraged the British to take more interest in the newfound diamond wealth of the Boer republics. And, thankfully for them, the Boers suffered a defeat at the hands of the nearby Pedi people in 1877. This, along with the ongoing Zulu threat, encouraged the Boers to accept British protection, and the British then sent an army to crush Sekukuni, the king of the Pedi people. Around the same time, the British also finally defeated the Xhosa, who they had been fighting for decades. But now, under governors like Freya, the British were more keen to expand, so they fully annexed the Xhosa lands, and then came the Anglo-Zulu War. Governor Freya was presented a cause for war when a colonial engineer and a trader were taken prisoner by a group of Zulus when they were working near the border. They were released, but Freya issued an ultimatum that he knew the Zulu king Cetshwayo could not accept, as it included disbanding his entire army. After the deadline for the ultimatum passed, the British declared war in January 1879, but famously their first invasion ended in disaster at the Battle of Isandlwana. The British public was outraged and they sort of forced a reluctant British government to send in reinforcements to defeat the Zulu. And I say reluctant because Prime Minister Disraeli, and many prime ministers before him, were more focused on Russia, India and the likes. For instance, Lord Palmerston advised the Belgians against buying Cuba from the Spanish way back in the 1830s, arguing that colonies are unwieldy and expensive. Even Disraeli's own Secretary of the Colonies, Sir Michael Hicks Beach, wrote, "The fact is that matters in Eastern Europe and India were so serious an aspect that we cannot have a Zulu war, in addition to other greater and too possible troubles." So the British favoured the idea of a soft empire, which allowed the British to dominate trade across the world, in particular in South America, without the need to rule over people. So the anti-colonial stance wasn't born out of a noble idea, but it was more pragmatic. And it wasn't just the British who felt this way. The Germans under Bismarck was more focused on Europe and maintaining alliances there, but independent colonists would force his hand. Therefore, the whole scramble was championed through the actions of some men: Rhodes, Leopold, Frere, Luderitz and others. Now this may seem like a bit of a simplification, but there was never a unified protectionist plan to acquire new markets and resources. This is especially true as the African colonies very rarely turned a profit and never provided a huge market for European goods, which were still mainly sent to the Americas or Asia. Of course, some people made a great deal of money exploiting the rubber and diamonds, but more was made via the soft empires in South America, or even opening up and modernizing Japan, China and the likes. So small colonies like Hong Kong or Singapore proved a better investment than fighting in the deserts of Sudan. And this policy of just collecting small trading posts had been the Europeans' policy in Africa for centuries. But going back to South Africa, the Zulus were defeated at Rorke's Drift while reinforcements arrived. These fresh troops launched a second invasion of the Zulu kingdom, captured Cetshwayo, and divided his kingdom up into small chiefdoms. These would all later be brought under British control, but there was a problem for the British. Now the Boer republics no longer needed their protection, so they declared their independence in 1880, starting the First Boer War between Transvaal and Britain. The British Gatling guns that were so effective against other opponents proved to be pretty useless against the Boer marksmen and their guerrilla tactics. So after numerous embarrassing defeats, Prime Minister Gladstone admitted defeat and the Boer republics remained independent for now. As for the Boers, they had been branching out and looking to expand their influence into southern Africa. So throughout the 1870s, they had embarked on the Doorsland Treks, which took them through Botswana, Namibia, and even as far north as Angola. Some of them would remain in Angola for decades before returning south to Namibia, but many died along the way and no large Boer communities were established in their new homelands. And, of course, the Portuguese were not open to allowing new republics being formed in their colonies, and they faced opposition in Namibia from the ruling Herero chiefs. Besides Egyptian debt in British South Africa, the third major development that occurred in the 1870s was Leopold II of Belgium hiring Henry Morton Stanley to explore the Congo. And this brings me to what I believe was the major cause behind the scramble: the emergence of new colonial powers, and a sort of panic to claim colonies out of a fear that someone else would take them. 3 European nations emerged in the 19th century that would go on to claim colonies: Belgium, Italy and Germany. The Italians, as discussed on the last episode, purchased land in Eritrea, while the Belgians had been desperate to acquire colonies ever since they achieved their independence in 1830. Plus, Belgium was something of an economic powerhouse, at least in comparison to its size, as they underwent a rapid period of industrialization. They built hundreds of miles of railway lines and were producing more coal and iron than the Austrians for most of the 1800s. So they had wealth, but no empire. Leopold II had heard of the journeys of Henry Morton Stanley, and he was the only person to agree to fund further exploration of the Congo. But Stanley was a little shocked to find out about Leopold's intentions. As he said, "It is a question of creating a new state as big as possible and of running it. It is clearly understood that there should be no question of granting the slightest political power to the Negroes in this project. That would be absurd." But to the rest of the world, Leopold projected a far more humanitarian mission. In 1876, he hosted a geographical conference in Brussels, and created an international African association. Philanthropists, mapmakers and scientists were all invited to attend and discuss how to map out Africa in order to better stop the slave trade and even provide medicine to the people. But, of course, this was all just a mask. Stanley was tasked with buying land in the Congo in exchange for meagre gifts, like bolts of cloth. You may be wondering why the African leaders were willing to sell their land to the Europeans, but I think French explorer Christian de Bonchamps said it best. The treaties with these little African tyrants, which generally consist of 4 long pages, of which they do not understand a word, and to which they sign a cross in order to have peace and receive gifts, are really only serious matters for the Europeans, in the event of disputes over territories. Plus there was the immediate threat of being killed by the Europeans, as what happened to some particularly resistant leaders. Then there was another threat coming from the east, and that's the Zanzibari slave traders under the leadership of Tipu Tip. He had thousands of slaves working in clove plantations over in Zanzibar, but by the late 19th century he had pushed far into the heart of Africa, destroying hundreds of villages and capturing thousands of slaves. This caused panic and left huge parts of Congo unpopulated, while he styled himself as the leader of the Eastern Congo. Plus within the various African states inside of the Congo, there had been a great shift taking place. The Kingdom of Luba, which was formed way back in the 1500s, was the old power, and had a number of tributary states. But with the arrival of the Zanzibaris, their power began to diminish. Nearby, the same thing was happening to the Kingdom of Kuba, a kingdom which incorporated a couple dozen ethnicities, including the Pygmies. But they were remarkably suspicious of the Europeans and would kill any missionaries. So the Christians had to rely on a black American named William Henry Shepherd to enter the country in the 1880s and establish Christian missions. Then in the south, the Lunda Kingdom once controlled an expanse of land larger than France. They used to hire the Chokwe people as warriors and hunters, but the Chokwe would break free from their rule, and in the 1880s they took over a lot of the old Lunda Kingdom. The Chokwe, then in power, then began to enslave people and traded with Tipu Tip, the Zanzibari trader. The Chokwe themselves were quite a warring people and fought more wars against the Umbunda people. The Umbunda won this war, but their new power worried another neighbour known as the Luvala. Now the Luvala have some customs that are somewhat unique, as they believe in maternal inheritance. Also, coming of age can be quite intense. For instance, a boy is sent to live in a bush camp for months by himself, while a girl remains in a grass hunt for months, being educated by an older lady. These Luvala people were defeated by the Umbundu. Yet, despite all of these wars between the different groups, they continue to have quite an extensive trading network. This was because only the Ovenbundu, living on the Angolan coast, had direct trade with the Portuguese and Europeans, but they received their goods like wax and rubber from Congo. Therefore, they relied on caravans of people journeying between the states of Umbundu Luvala and other states like Kazembe. Most of these rulers, by the way, would remain in power until the 20th century, and some, like the King of Umbundu, has even been recently restored. Otherwise, below the land of Tipu Tip, there was another new arrival in the area. He was Mziri, and he came from Tanzania. He took a militia west, armed with modern rifles, to carve out a state of his own. He formed an alliance with Tipu Tip to conquer the Kazembe kingdom and kill their king, Umwata Kazembe VIII. He then went on to conquer more villages, and in each of the conquered villages, he'd take for himself a wife. In the end, he had over 500 wives, and these allowed him to form alliances, have a hostage should a rebellion come, and a permanent spy working against their own families. Plus, as he was in the center of Africa, he traded weapons with the Ovumbundu and Portuguese in the west and the Arabs in the east. Then there was yet another new arrival in the region, and this was Mirambo, whose name literally means corpses, and he was a Nyamwezi warlord that Stanley called the African Bonaparte. Now Mirambo had learned a lot from Shaka Zulu, as the Zulus' expansions in the south pushed people north, and they eventually revealed tactics and information to Mirambo. Then, using these tactics as well as modern firearms, he created a formidable army and also a state for himself. This again was mainly based on the slave and ivory trade, but he would later die in 1884 and his state would disintegrate. So there were 3 powerful warlords decimating the interior of Congo and Tanzania. The states in Angola, Zambia and Congo were all fighting one another, the Belgians and Stanley had arrived on the coast, and then the French also arrived nearby. They arrived just to the north of the Congo River, where the Luango Kingdom ruled. Now they were once probably under the control of the nearby Kingdom of Congo, but had since broken free. The Luango Kingdom were famed cloth producers and exported a great deal to the Europeans, while their neighbours, the Anziku Kingdom, produced a great deal of metal. And metal was so important to the Anziku Kingdom that it was not uncommon for the Teke people who lived there to choose a blacksmith as their chief in times of a succession crisis. Well, the Italian-born Pierre Savignan de Brazza began to explore this region, largely using his own funds. Then, in the 1880s, he arrived in the Anziku Kingdom and met King Ilo I, who was willing to put his kingdom under the protection of the French in exchange for the increased trade. Thus, France and Belgium had, within months of one another, set themselves up on different sides of the Congo River. King Ilo I died shortly after making the agreement, but his wife, Ngaliforu, stayed close with the French and would remain so for many years. She was born in the 1860s, but lived into her 90s. So she died in 1956, just a couple years before the Republic of Congo would get their independence. Now this puts the whole colonization of Africa into perspective, as a woman who was old enough to agree to fall under French protection, encouraged her people to fight in 2 world wars, met Charles de Gaulle, and was almost there when the French left. Anyway, Brazza secured a bit of land and created an outpost named Brazzaville, while nearby, Stanley created Leopoldville. The two men would enter into a race in building up their towns in order to become the dominant trading hub. Well, Brazza himself didn't stay there. He left behind a Senegalese volunteer named Malamine Camara to supervise the city. But all of this was being observed by the Portuguese nearby. Although the Belgians and the French successfully avoided signing any treaties in land claimed by the Portuguese were of course suspicious of new European arrivals. And this wasn't the only area heating up, as back in the north, the British and French were both ruling the financial affairs of the indebted Egyptians. Their ruler Ismail agreed to be a constitutional ruler and had to appoint a prime minister, but he tried to stop paying back debts to the British and French after unpaid soldiers rebelled. So all the Europeans united to force Ismail to resign, and his son Tewfik took over. But Tewfik was not the greatest leader. For instance, he followed the advice of his officers in banning peasants from the military academy. This move was a little motivated by race, as the Egyptian officers, like the Mamluks before them, were largely Circassian, Albanian and the likes. So many Arabs were angered by this, and also the fact that Europeans were controlling Egyptian finances. So they united behind only one of 4 Arab colonels called Ahmed Urabi, and they rebelled. In 1881 they marched on the palace and forced Tewfik to create a nationalistic parliament. The European nations were of course worried by this, especially when foreigners started being attacked on the streets. So the French and British sent ships to Alexandria, but Urabi refused their demands and an anti-Christian riot broke out. The British would later invade alone because, although the French had been calling for war for much longer, they had become distracted elsewhere. As when the great powers met at the end of the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, they more or less pushed the French to take Tunisia, and this was all part of the same negotiations that saw the British take Cyprus. Now there were a few reasons for them to push for France to take Tunisia. First of all, Italy, the newly formed nation, was determined to take more colonies beside their post in Eritrea, and Tunisia was a prime target. But Britain didn't want Italy to control both sides of the Straits of Sicily and have the ability to cut off trade from the Suez Canal. Germany, on the other hand, wanted to keep France distracted with empire building rather than trying to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine, while France, under Jules Ferry, was keen to go along with it. He was a supporter of colonialism and wanted to expand French holdings across Asia and Africa. Plus, Tunisia would also secure the Algerian borders and prevent Italy from becoming too powerful. Italy, meanwhile, under Benedetto Cairoli, was encouraging Italian migration to Tunisia, playing a more long-term strategy, and they believed that the British would never allow such a takeover. As for Tunisia, Mohammed III as-Sadiq had ruled since 1859. He attempted to modernize his country, but lacked the funds to do so. Tunisia had, after all, lost a great deal of revenue from piracy. Most of their 1 million people were farmers or nomads, and they suffered from many droughts. He therefore welcomed European investment, and, like in Egypt, an international commission arrived to manage the country's finances. So taxes were raised, and this pushed some tribes to launch raids. The Chromia tribe raided across the border into French Algeria, giving them a cause for war. 36,000 Frenchmen quickly moved into Tunisia and forced the Bey to accept the French takeover, but he still remained as head of state in theory. Italy responded by formally annexing their colony in Eritrea and expanding it a little bit. While, back in Egypt with the French away, this meant the British attacked alone when Arabi refused to respond to their ultimatum. The following Anglo-Egyptian war was short. Urabi was exiled and Tewfik was restored to the throne. But the British would remain until their debts had been repaid, and this in practice meant that Egypt was now in the British Empire. It also meant that the British would now get involved in Egyptian wars in Sudan, which was becoming a very volatile place. Way back in 1873, Ismail appointed General Charles Gordon to run the equatorial provinces, but there he made a very powerful enemy. This was Sabir Rama, and the British described him as the Slaver King, but he had conquered Darfur on behalf of the Egyptians. Sabir Rama tried to have his position as ruler of Darfur made official through bribes, but on his trip north, he was arrested. His son Suleiman unsuccessfully rebelled, but more importantly, a general in his armies named Rabi az-Zubayr continued the fight. He took a mercenary army, reconquered some land, and began to push west, taking over Bornu, the ancient empire. So he carved out a state for himself and continued slave trading, and he will be very important in the decades to come. Yet back in Sudan, a cleric named Muhammad Ahmad began gathering followers who despised the Egyptian occupation and high taxation. Then he declared himself the Mahdi, or the Redeemer of the Islamic world, and launched a jihad in 1881. The Egyptians, on the other hand, despite having all of the modern weapons, led terribly planned expeditions, similar to what they did during their wars with the Egyptians. So in 1882 they were ambushed, losing their weapons, uniforms and supplies. And this is around the same time that the British took over Egypt, and another poorly planned expedition under William Hicks was sent south in 1883. At the Battle of El Obeid, they were again crushed, so the British encouraged the Egyptians to leave the area. To oversee the withdrawal, they would send Gordon to Khartoum, but this would end in disaster, as the city would be captured and the Mahdist War would begin. But that's in 1885, so we'll again put a pin in it for now. Meanwhile, over in the west, there was further movement during this time. The British had already took Lagos, bought the Danish colonies, and fought the Ashanti War along the west coast. Then, in the 1870s, they bought the Dutch colonies in the Gold Coast, upsetting the balance of power in the region. The Dutch had, way back in the 17th century, signed a treaty of protection with the Ashanti Kingdom, while the British often supported their enemies. So now, with the Dutch gone, the Ashanti invaded in 1873. The British responded quickly and troops were dispatched from the West Indies, Wales and Scotland. Plus, using locals, they began to construct roads through the dense forests to the Ashanti capital of Kumasi. This, the Third Ashanti War, was over quickly. The Scottish Black Watch in particular charged at them with bayonets, forcing the Ashanti to flee the Battle of Amuaful. The capital city was then evacuated, but tragically, the British put it to the torch. This city of course contained a great deal of artwork and treasures, but what I find more tragic, the British did complement the city's collection of books contained in the palaces, which were apparently written in many languages. The Ashanti couldn't recover from this war, and they'd be annexed a couple decades later. Meanwhile, in the region, the French had a brand new enemy of their own, the Wasolo Empire. This was an offshoot of another recently established empire, the Tokolur Empire, which was founded by Umar Saido Tall. When he died in the 1860s, his generals began to assert their independence, and the most successful was Samori Toure. The Wasolo Empire that he created was primarily made up of Mandinka people, who you may have heard of if you've seen Roots. But slaves were instrumental in his military successes, as his armies wouldn't function without the Sofa, a military unit of slaves which goes back to the old Mali Empire. These, however, were also equipped with modern rifles, most of which were purchased from the British, who became worried about the French expansion in the area. The French clashed with Samori first in 1883, and then they angered him more in 1885 when they established bases along the coast of what would become Guinea. He was so worried by this that he even offered to accept British protection, but this was refused, as this would have almost inevitably brought the British and French into a war with one another. So Samori would continue to rule independently for another decade or so, primarily because after their first engagement, the French were alarmed by his well-drilled soldiers using modern rifles and didn't seek out confrontation until later on. Then there was another event to occur just before the conference that divided Africa up into spheres. This was the French invasion of Madagascar. Now, the French did control a couple of islands near Madagascar, but the British had taken Mauritius from them during the Napoleonic Wars. Therefore, they both desired control, or at least influence, over the ruling Marinda dynasty. This dynasty in Madagascar under Radama I had united most of the island. But in the middle of the 19th century, there were a number of coups and power kept changing hands. Each of the respective leaders began to side with either the British or the French. For instance, Radama II, who ruled in the 1860s, signed an agreement with the French, promising them many concessions, including the right to exploit all of the forest's minerals and unoccupied land. But Radama II only ruled for 2 years before being killed, and successive governments and rulers would ignore this treaty with the French, called the Lambert Treaty. The leader of this coup against Radama II, called the aristocratic coup, became the new prime minister. He and his younger brother who succeeded him were more keen on cementing ties with the British and began to modernize their country. This included the abolition of slavery, improving the education system, and hiring Brits to train their army. However, this was almost too little too late, as the French acted quickly to prevent them falling under British influence. In 1883, they used the past treaty to justify an invasion, and by 1885, they forced the Madagascans into their sphere of influence. But this fact was often denied, and another invasion would be necessary 10 years later to cement French control. And finally, by 1884, a new colonial power had emerged, and that was Germany. Bismarck had not been interested in the colonial game, preferring to focus on Europe. But he could do little to stop various colonial groups and private businessmen who went to Africa, and almost forced his hand. One of these societies was being led by Hermann, Prince of Hohenlohe-Langenburg, and they had over 15,000 members, most of which were obviously very influential aristocrats, politicians, and businessmen. One of them was a merchant named Adolf Luderitz, who went to modern-day Namibia and signed an agreement with Chief Joseph Fredericks II of the Nama people. For £100 in gold and 200 rifles, he purchased a stretch of land far larger than Joseph had anticipated, because in the treaty, they bought 20 German geographical miles, which was closer to 140 kilometers, not the 30 kilometers that Joseph would have thought. This land, Luderitz believed, would be a far better place for German migrants to go to, who were already leaving en masse to the Americas. Plus, it would give Germany the prestige that they wanted. But the Germans would also expand in the west, especially in Cameroon. This region at the time was being ruled by Kings Bel and Akwa. They had engaged in trade with the British and even sought their protection at times. For instance, King Bel wrote to the British saying, "I at last despaired, having not received any answer. I hence concluded that neither the consuls nor yet the English government cared anything about my country." So he was writing to the British but got no response. So when a German company arrived in 1884 named Janssen and Tomarlin, the kings agreed to sign a treaty with them. But this treaty was again vague and merely a treaty of friendship and trade initially. Gustav Nachtigal was instrumental in setting up German colonies in Cameroon and also in Togo, where they negotiated a treaty with King Umlapa III. But some stories suggest that chiefs had been kidnapped and forced into signing the treaties as well. There were other targets for the Germans to go after, like the Kapitai and Koba over in Guinea, but the Anglo-French Convention of 1882 divided Sierra Leone and Guinea between the two countries, meaning if the Germans moved into Guinea, they would risk a war. The other German colonies were established over in the east, where Karl Peters formed the East African Company and travelled out to modern-day Tanzania to sign agreements with small groups of people, like the Ukami and Unguru. This new territory was called Peter's Land, and he would later threaten to sell it to the Belgians if he didn't receive Imperial German protection for himself. This tactic was used across Africa, as the colonists forced the German government to offer protection. So in 1884 the Germans sent fleets and commissioners to the new colonies, and brought them all into the German Empire. But then Bismarck needed to get them recognized as German colonies by the international community. So the Berlin Conference was held in late 1884 to early 1885. Meanwhile, the British took over some little posts to counter German influence, like in Walvis Bay in Namibia. But this was all pretty inconsequential, as Bismarck was keen to host the conference to keep the peace and cement control over his new colonies. But he had just a few years earlier held the Congress of Berlin, which divided up the Ottoman Empire after their war with Russia, and now he was center stage on the treaties dividing up Africa. People have debated why he suddenly went from an anti-colonist to a colonist almost overnight, as, before, he once said he would be happy to see France take over all of Africa to keep them occupied. But in just a couple of months, he was claiming chunks of Africa. Maybe it was all due to public opinion, or in spite of the anti-colonial Liberal Party, who he wanted to undermine. It's all really hard to say. Anyway, 14 countries attended the conference, 5 of which had nothing to gain: Austria-Hungary, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, and the United States. Now you may ask yourself why these countries didn't claim anything. Well, simply put, besides the United States, they were all far too poor to enter the colonial game. It was expensive to take over land, police it, and have a large enough navy to protect your interests. Sweden, for instance, was particularly poor in the 19th century, and their population was in decline because huge numbers of people were fleeing to the United States. The US, meanwhile, for the time being at least, opposed creating empires, and besides Liberia, had no interest in the continent. Plus, you could also throw the Ottoman Empire into this group. They clung on to Libya, but really didn't have much say at all. They were weakened and on their last legs at the time. Then there was also Russia, who may also be seen as a useless member of the conference, but as you'll see in the next video, they did have some, albeit very small, colonial ambitions. The Spanish as well were pretty inactive. They would soon lose their colonies like the Philippines and Cuba, and were suffering from political instability. So they kept hold of their territory in Equatorial Guinea, and they did make a very small claim in the coast of southern Morocco or Western Sahara. This was nearby islands they already owned, but their control was pretty limited for a while. They faced fierce resistance from the locals, and the only people who accepted their protection had no rights to give it away. But in 15 years or so, they would form an alliance with the French and divide up Morocco. The Portuguese, on the other hand, despite being one of the poorest nations in Europe, would desperately try to expand their holdings, especially after Brazil had achieved their independence. In the north, they did little to expand Guinea-Bissau. They kept hold of their islands like Cape Verde, but their true goals were in the south. Their pink map, as it was called, highlights their ambitions to unite the colonies of Angola and Mozambique. So it would have included Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. As for the other nations, the Belgians had taken land in the Congo and would set about expanding it, and the Italians would move further into East Africa. The French meanwhile looked to connect their colonies of Guinea and Senegal in the west to Djibouti in the east, while the British hoped to claim everything in between Cape Town and Cairo. Well, this is the often repeated story, but the French and British ambitions really only became prominent in the 1890s. Cecil Rhodes, for instance, only came into prominence in the years following the conference, and he was the champion of the Cape to Cairo ambition. Plus, it was never an official position, more like the words of one man, albeit a very influential man. The same thing could be said for the French, so they really didn't bring these ambitions to the conference. The conference mainly just discussed the current claims and set the boundaries between them. One of the most important items discussed was the hinterland theory, where the countries had the right to claim any land beyond their coastal possessions. But this was largely ignored in later years as it presented more problems than it solved. The conference, however, did establish the idea that each country had to establish some sort of control over an area in order to claim it. This meant the Portuguese claims based on discovery were null and void, and every country would at least have to set up some form of base or sign treaties in order to claim a region. So this meant that the conference was sort of opposite of drawing lines on a map, besides of course the boundaries between already established colonies like in West Africa. The conference actually began a race, sometimes a literal race, to sign treaties and establish control, as it was only when they established control that the colony would be recognized as theirs. In 1885, the Europeans and Americans met at the Conference of Berlin. There they discussed the future of Africa in the wake of Germany and Belgium in particular taking colonies. Their arrival in the continent seemingly panicked the older empires, and this is evident by the Bechuanaland expedition, which took place while the powers were meeting in Berlin. This British expedition saw 4,000 men march north from Cape Town to modern-day Botswana. On the way there, they took over the new Boer Republic of Stellaland without any bloodshed, while to the north, Botswana was home to a number of different tribes. Most of them were Tswana people. One of the largest of these groups was the Bamangwato, and they were under the leadership of Khama III, who most famously converted to Christianity and fought a number of wars against his political rivals to keep Botswana Christian. But there was also Kagosi Gaborone, who ruled the Tlokwa people, and he lived until he was 106 years old. But as for Khama, like some of the other leaders, he grew wary of Boer expansion, and even the expansion of the Germans, who would set up camp in Namibia, and the Matabele Africans to the north of him. So when the British arrived, although some resisted, most fell under British protection. This, after all, was ultimately the goal of the expedition, to prevent the Germans or even the Boers encircling the British Cape Colony. The local rulers in Botswana for the most part kept their position, despite the likes of Cecil Rhodes advocating for complete annexation and incorporation into the Cape Colony. But to the north, in East Africa, the British and Germans were willing to work together and establish spheres of influence through a treaty in 1886. But this land, which would go on to become Tanzania and Kenya, was up until that point controlled by Oman. Under Said bin Sultan, the capital was actually moved from Muscat to Zanzibar, and he expanded his holdings by taking Mombasa in 1837. However, he died in the 1850s, and two of his sons split up the kingdom between Oman and Zanzibar, which was taken over by Mujib bin Said. So Zanzibar was then an independent country ruling over the east coast of Africa. But under Karl Peters, the Germans had already established a protectorate in the hinterland of Tanzania. Plus, the Germans had also signed an agreement with the rulers of Vituland. Now this state had broke away from the Arab rulers who ruled in Zanzibar and became a safe haven for runaway slaves. Incensed by this, the sultans of Zanzibar launched many attacks and slave raids, but this just pushed them into accepting German protection. The new Sultan of Zanzibar, Bargash bin Said, however, refused to accept the loss of his mainland territories. But he died in 1888, and his brother, Khalifa bin Said, was all too happy to acknowledge European control, especially as there were British and German ships in the area. This takeover, however, wasn't peaceful though, as both Swahili people and Arabs united behind a man named Abu Shiri and rebelled. But the Germans had already formed the Schutztruppe, a force made up of Africans, otherwise known as the Ashkari, and they helped quell this rebellion. Yet I hesitate to say local Africans, because many of the soldiers active in this campaign were employed from as far away as Egypt or across the border in Portuguese Mozambique. So now the British and Germans were expanding in South and East Africa, but further north still, along the coast of Somalia, the British also made claims around the same time. Now, the last time I mentioned Somalia, there was the Adal and Adjuran Sultanates, but they had long gone. The Somalis in fact had lost territory to the Ethiopians and suffered from raids from the Oromo people who had been migrating north. But in the place of these old sultanates sprang a number of new smaller sultanates like Isak. They had actually fought the British way back in the 1820s. At that time, the British were active in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf and forced the leaders of what would become the UAE under their protection after the Persian Gulf campaign. But while one of their ships was docked in the important trading city of Berbera, the locals attacked and killed them, prompting a blockade and assault on the city. Then, as would be the case with most of these Somali sultanates, there was infighting, clan disputes and fracturing. Many of these Somali clans like the Ogaden now lay outside of what would become Somalia, while inside the country, many of the clan disputes remain. For instance, in the 20th century, President Bara and his Darod clan committed genocide against the Isak tribe of the north. So in the late 19th century, there were a lot of new sultanates springing up. For instance, the Habia Yunus Sultanate would eventually break off from the larger Isak Sultanate. Then on the tip of the Horn of Somalia, there was the Marjateen Sultanate, which was then led by Osman Mahamud. But there was even challenges to his throne, notably from his cousin, Yusuf Ali Kananid. Yusuf was initially unsuccessful and forced to flee to Yemen, but he returned with Yemeni soldiers and created his own sultanate to the south, the Hobyo Sultanate, in 1878, just before the scramble took place. Then in between Isak and Marjateen, you had the Wasangali, and in the far south the Geladi, who were so powerful in the 1870s that they sailed to Zanzibar, attacked the city, freed some slaves and extracted tribute. Well, by 1887, the British had signed treaties with the sultans of Isak, Habia Yunis and Wasangali. Initially these formed British Somalia, and they fell under the control of British India, and this resource-poor region was often ignored by the British, as it mainly just supplied some meat to their base in Aden. But they would later lose a lot of men and resources fighting the Dervish movement a decade or so later. Many of the leaders who once signed a treaty with the British, like Mahmud Ali Shah of Wasangali, backed the rebellion and would be exiled as a result. Plus, just as a side note, he was another ruler who saw the end of colonialism, as he lived until 1960. So very similar to Ungaliforo of the Congo if you watched the last episode. Then, just 1 year after they all signed treaties with the British, Yusuf Ali Kanadid of Hobyo and Osman Mahmud of Mojatin signed a treaty with the Italians. But this was largely just to protect themselves and use the Italians to seek out support in their own expansionist ambitions. So, like the British, they left the local rulers in power and left the territories largely alone. Nevertheless, the Italians had succeeded in getting more colonies, but they couldn't connect their colonies to Eritrea because of British and French Somaliland. But this brings me on to settlement, as the story differs widely across the board. But in these early days, the number of Europeans in the area was remarkably small by and large. For instance, in Kenya, the British would settle large numbers of people in the region known as the White Highlands. But that came about in the 20th century, so even by the First World War, only 1,300 white people had settled there, and most of these were South Africans. Whereas, going back to this period, only 100 people had moved there by 1903. Rule was therefore remarkably indirect in most places, and it wouldn't have been possible to rule over nations without the aid of local rulers. For instance, you can take German Togoland. This was possibly one of the most developed colonies in terms of railway lines and the likes. Well, by the First World War, only 300 Germans lived in the country, but back in this period, only 31 Germans lived in the capital of Lomé. Obviously, this isn't true across the board. For instance, in Algeria, the French were relocating there in huge numbers, and the new population, called the Pied Noir, made up 10% of the population, even in the middle of the 19th century. And then, obviously, South Africa and the diamond mines attracted more European immigrants. But then, just to give you one more example, in the Ivory Coast, a colony which the French held for decades, the total number of white people living there, even in 1960, just before independence, was 0.009% of the total population. To put this into comparison, there were more Montenegrin Americans in the US than there were French settlers in the Ivory Coast. Or, as another comparison, you know that very few British people actually were able to rule India, but the numbers were in fact quite a lot higher. Like in 1901, the number of British living in India would have made up 0.05% of the population, plus of course they had the help of the princely states to rule over this country. So if you were to travel to many places within the colonies outside of the capitals, life would have appeared the same as it had done 30 years prior. Again, obviously this isn't everywhere, like if you went to Belgian Congo in the countryside, you would have seen a remarkable difference. But going back to the scramble, just to the west of Somalia, the Ethiopians were also expanding at a rapid rate. Emperor Johannes came to power shortly after the British expedition in the country, and he quickly looked to conquer the small kingdoms around him. Now, one interesting side note here on Ethiopia was their currency was the Maria Theresa taler. This would continue to be their currency until the Second World War, and you can probably tell by the name, this wasn't a locally minted coin. It was produced all the way over in Austria, but so many of these coins made their way south that they just adopted it as their own currency. Anyway, Johannes was initially just really the king of one province of Tigray, but he soon moved on Shiwa and got their king Menelik to submit to him. Therefore, Johannes was the king of kings and Menelik was the king of Shiwa. Together they continued to expand and took Jima in 1881 and the kingdom of Gojam in 1882 and Waliga shortly afterwards. Now they were ruling over a number of ethnicities and often treated them quite brutally. For instance, in Hotosa, just south of the newly created city of Addis Ababa, Menelik massacred 11,000 Oromo people in a single day in 1886, and he also cut off body parts of many of the dead. But although they were able to take over the Somali Ogaden, they were prevented from taking over Gilead, as Menelik's forces were crushed at the Battle of Luk. However, just across the Ethiopians' borders, there was the Italian colonies in Eritrea, and the Mahdists of Sudan. These Mahdists had rebelled against the Egyptians and in fact launched a jihad against them. The British, who had already entered Egypt, looked to leave the area as it had no real strategic value. So Charles Gordon was sent to oversee their withdrawal. However, in 1885, he was besieged inside Khartoum and killed when the Mahdists took the city just before a relief expedition made it there. This caused outrage within the British public who called for revenge, but it would take a while for them to get it. However, after Khartoum fell, Equatoria had been cut off from the north, and their governor was trapped behind enemy lines. He was Emin Pasha, an Ottoman doctor, who had hoped that the British would fully annex the region, but it was rejected. So a Scottish businessman named William Mackinnon pushed to send Henry Morton Stanley on an expedition to find him. But this Emin Pasha relief expedition was a colonial pursuit. Mackinnon himself was the owner of a shipping company which dominated trade around the Indian Ocean. Plus, he would later create the East Africa Company, looking to expand British control as far inland as Uganda. Furthermore, Stanley was still employed by Leopold II, who agreed to release him from his contract in exchange for taking a longer route to Equatoria, travelling on Belgian steamers through land he would later look to expand into. To the public though, this was not a military expedition, it was just a humanitarian one. However, during this expedition, a number of atrocities were committed, with one member in particular named William Stairs killing people at random. However, also Edmund Musgrave Bartelott was another person who would randomly beat and kill people, and apparently he descended into some sort of madness and believed he was being poisoned. But he also had a history of killing, as he had killed a Yemeni man for a minor indiscretion while on the campaign to relieve the siege of Khartoum. Then there was the Irish heir to the Jameson Whiskey Company, James Sligo Jameson, who bought a 10-year-old girl to sell to cannibals in order to sketch the ordeal and write about it. All of these people were also still open to buying slaves from Tipu Tip and the Arab slavers, or capturing their own en route. Their exploration into the region opened up Congo and even Uganda to the Europeans, decimated the local population through disease and murder, and importantly, expanded Belgian rule. This is because Stanley met with Tipu Tip and persuaded him to accept Belgian rule and divert trade to the Atlantic rather than the Indian Ocean. And it should also be said that they found Emin